Hello and welcome to Manga Demystified. My name is Nigel and I'm the co-founder of the manga brand Mayamada and co-host of the podcast Story X Story. And we are here today to discuss manga, as you might have guessed from the title. So I brought together a crew, a group, something of creators to discuss the topic. I was thinking like Avengers style, but then realized it's probably more like shonen style. To some of you, that will make sense. To some of you, hold on just a moment and it will make more sense as we go. So let me get to the introductions. First, we have Japanese manga artist Mikiko. Welcome.
Hello.
So Mikiko has been on our podcast, our Story X Story podcast before, where we talk about stories across pop culture. You're actually on our first interview episode, and now you're on our first video episode. So a bit of a trend there.
Yeah.
Also with us we have comic creator and podcast co-host or podcast host Lara Callan. Am I saying that right?
Hi. Callahan, yes.
Callahan. Okay, just making sure.
Laura's good.
Lara has also been on the podcast before, so we'll have like links to everyone's episodes in the show notes. A first timer with us who has never been on the podcast before, so this is like a new experience, is the co-founder of the animation studio The Line, Wesley Lewis. Wesley, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Cool, glad you're here. Be good to get your perspective. So, like I mentioned, this is the first video interview panel thing that we've done. But if you are interested in storytelling and comics, manga, anime, video games, you can check out the now mostly audio podcast, Story X Story, that I co-host. It's available pretty much wherever you get your podcast from. You can also send us your feedback on this discussion to feedback@mymada.com. And with that, we're going to get straight into our topic for today. So the reason why I wanted to have this discussion with you all is I've been an exhibitor at Thought Bubble, and most of the time I'm like one of the very few handful of manga creators that are there. And I've always had the impression that there's some awareness of manga, but maybe not enough, if in my biased opinion. So yeah, I just wanted to have this discussion because that's a shame, because obviously like manga is great, again biased opinion, but hopefully if you're not of that opinion we can convince you in the next 40 odd minutes. So yeah, we just wanted to talk about what manga is, beyond the stereotype that some people might know it for, how it's being used in and out of Japan, what the culture is around it, and yeah, hopefully get some people interested. So maybe the next time we go to like a physical Thought Bubble convention, there'll be like different reactions. So I want to get started with finding out where everyone got into manga and or anime or anything to do with it. So I'll start with Wes, because you got an interesting use of the anime style. Like, how did you find your way into that, and do you have any favorite animes?
How did I find my way into it? It's a good question, actually. I think from probably quite young, I was always interested in kind of Japanese inspired kind of animation without actually realizing it was Japanese. I think it's only probably, let me think. I want to say it's when I first saw Akira that when I started looking back on the things I watched as a kid, I realized, like, saw the similarities and realized that a lot of these things came from Japan. But it could have been Samurai Pizza Cats.
Oh, yeah,
I'm not entirely sure now.
Okay.
It could have been one of those two things, but I know there was definitely a point where I was looking at animation and all the stuff that I really loved and all the stuff that I liked. When I started looking back on the things I watched as a kid, like Voltron, Gatchaman, all that kind of stuff. Even I don't know, more Western TV series like Thundercats as well. Like if you look at the intro, that's a very Japanese kind of aesthetic. The Kaneda style, strong keyframes and crazy shapes.
Yeah, for me it was quite different, obviously, because I'm half Japanese, so my mother is Japanese. I was born in Tokyo as well, and but I only lived there for a very short time. So the only time I spent in Japan usually was summer vacation, like summer holidays, and any sort of travel to visit family. And I went to German schools because my other half is German, so my dad's German, and the system was so that like people just didn't know what anime or manga is, and I felt very isolated because we moved around the world a lot. So I lived in a lot of countries, and nobody knew anything about manga or anime at that time. So for me, it was kind of like I grew up with it, and it was always a piece of home. And whenever I went back to Japan, I would just buy loads of manga, and bring them with me wherever I went. And if my aunt would film, like she would record things on TV, like I remember Kenshin was running, and she would like record episodes and then send them to me and stuff, like VHS tapes. So it was really very much a piece of identity for me, that I missed very much when I was out in the world, so to speak. And then whenever I came back, it was just like kind of this comforting thing. And then eventually the manga boom happened, where everybody started to read manga and everybody started to watch anime, and then suddenly I had access to everything. So I'm really happy. Yeah. When it comes to favorites, it's kind of difficult because I think there's like a very special thing for every stage of my life, I suppose. And so it's kind of hard to say it's this one thing. When I was very, very, very little, I used to watch a series called Gegege no Kitaro, and it was like a ghost story series, and it was like this half ghost boy. Well, you can see why I might have identified with that. He was like half ghost, half human, and he would like do little errands for people and ghosts alike to sort of have them live in harmony. And it was kind of really kind of spooky still, which I really liked. So that was big in the 80s that I really liked. And then as I grew older, I realized that anime and manga was a thing of itself, like a real, like a genre, I suppose. It never really occurred to me until then. And then I decided at that point I wanted to be a manga artist. And that was when I was around 12 years old. And I read my first Shonen Jump comic manga. So I've read Yu Yu Hakusho, which I think was translated to Poltergeist Report. And it's not even that great, but it kind of introduced me
It was enough
to
to
like
pull you in.
this genre. Yeah, it pulled me in for this it's like boys going on an adventure, and I much preferred the boy stories over the girl stories. And just like beating the odds and fighting evil, like that was just so cool to me.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then later on, I think nowadays, if people ask me what's your favorite series in general, it would be Berserk, which is very different from what I draw.
Very different.
It's very dark.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and heavy. And I really like heavy drama, tragedy, like that's my jam.
Cool.
But just listening to Wes and Kiko as well, it's interesting to hear that I think the three of us have a similar kind of introduction as a young kid, and not necessarily knowing it was a thing, just enjoying the medium. So my first introduction to manga was, I think I was in year 6, Sailor Moon. I was in the US and I found it was volume 4, so I wasn't cognizant enough to like look for number 1. And I remember I think I may have sat in the store and read most of it, so then we had to buy it, kind of thing, right? But then I remember absolutely enjoying it. You know, it's an amazing story, and book 4 is where Sailor Jupiter is introduced, so most of the scouts are there. And this idea of having this kind of girl unit just struck right in the heart of a 10-year-old girl. You know what I mean? That was it. And I thinking about it, I didn't register it was anything different to anything else I would have enjoyed when I was 10. So it didn't fall into any category of manga or anime or even Japanese. I don't think I conceived that it wasn't anything but cool. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah. And then it was a snowball effect. So I remember having only one book. I wanted to read more. And then coming back to England, there was only maybe 2 or 3 places where I could buy manga. Forbidden Planet, I live in London as well, so Forbidden Planet in Tottenham Court Road, and that was it. That was it. And so I'd have to go and spend my money to try and get these Sailor Moon books, which I struggled with, and then I bought loads on the internet. And then you get recommendations. So by this stage as well, I was on kind of the manga trajectory to finding out about more things down the same route, basically. I didn't actually have an introduction to anime proper, if you don't count like Pokemon. I didn't even see the Sailor Moon anime for a long time. So I really did just dig. So you start off with Sailor Moon, and then I think the next thing I ventured into maybe could have been Dragon Ball, the original series, without ever seeing it. I think because I didn't have Sky, so I couldn't get Cartoon Network to watch these things. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to read the book instead.
Yeah, that was a key component.
Yeah, I think I only really attributed it to being Japanese, and it's something different to being the expectation of UK comics when I was older. And then suddenly you find that actually people who grew up on English or American comics or cartoons see anime as different and separate. I'm here to tell you you're wrong. They are the same. Essentially, they are the same, except that the storytelling medium in Japan is so much more ubiquitous. That's why it can touch the hearts of a 10-year-old girl, talk about like friendships and female friendships and courage and all of that. But at the same time, Berserk is incredibly on the other end of the spectrum. And to lump them into one thing of this is what manga is, it's Sailor Moon and Berserk and then Dragon Ball and all of these other things. It just sounds mad to put it all into one.
Yeah. So
you asked me my favourite as well. Sailor Moon, I'm just going to say that. It started it all.
Okay.
Sailor Moon.
Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely unpack a little bit more of manga as a medium and not just a genre. But so I would just say what Wes says. Once Wes says Samurai Pizza Cats, that was definitely me. So I came into things like backwards. I was very much watching more than reading, and only recently, to be fair, relatively recently, since starting a manga brand and wanting to sort of learn more. But yeah, definitely Samurai Pizza Cats and Transformers were my thing without even realizing they were anime at all. They were just like the cool things I needed to watch and go to like the local video store, immediately dating myself to get the next like Transformers thing. So yeah, so it's cool. Everyone's kind of like come at it in relatively similar ways, like not having that initial awareness of this is a manga or anime, is just a cool thing. So before we go any further, I wanted to just establish like a grounding of what is manga. So Makiko, as you're someone who was born in Tokyo, can you just give us a basic like what is manga, what is anime, particularly versus sort of the Western counterparts?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I noticed that whenever I was in Japan, people would use the word manga pretty much as a blanket term for anything that was sequential art or storytelling through imagery in some form. So it really didn't mean like comics from Japan at all. It was just anything sequential, anything that tells a story in form of drawings. And I think over the years, I've noticed that with this idea of separating the Eastern and Western comics, people have started to refer to American comics as amekomi, like shortening things again, American comics, versus manga, for example. So that's in my opinion, fairly newer development, but it's probably to differentiate the style. That's what I think personally. So essentially I use the word comic mostly for everything I do, and I include manga in it just because people that I meet at conventions tend to understand comic better. And if they say, oh, this is Japanese, then I say, yeah, we might call it manga, but it's still a comic. I mean, it's still the same thing. So that's how I tend to use it, just to sort of keep people, not to scare anybody off or anything.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I get into that, like how to refer to it, because like I said at the beginning, sort of mayamada is a manga brand, and I use that term, but then I also use comic. I just interchange, because to me, like you say, it's kind of, they're almost one and the same. Obviously there are sort of differences if you dig deeper, but it's it's another way to tell a story. So yeah, I just wanted to get that out, and like in particular, because although there are both ways to tell stories, like you say, manga and comics being sequential art, there are differences. So I'm wondering if, whether it's manga or anime, if anyone has any particular aspects of the medium that they particularly enjoy. Lara, is there anything like about manga and or anime that you particularly enjoy that it does really well?
I guess, I think if we think about it in comparison to traditional Western comics, kind of the question is, what do I get from manga that I don't get from Western comics? And I do touch back to a very broad storytelling. So I can look to Japanese comics or manga to give me stories that I don't see out of Western artists. So I don't know if the breadth of everything, I can't think of anything off the top of my head now, but I don't see the stories. So for example, sorry to go back to Sailor Moon, but I'll harp on about it. I'm actually wearing a Sailor Moon top at the same time. So, but I mean, I think, and I've talked to lots of people about this, but where are the stories about female friendships and collaborating with other women in the Western comic world? And that's one example. And then even things like Akira, which is a very dystopian teenage story, predominantly surrounded, there's drugs involved, there's Tokyo being demolished in 2020. Where are those stories in Western comics? I feel like sometimes I can pivot to manga and I get this wealth of every different type of story, and I pivot towards the Western comics and I don't see that, and I'm completely open to ideas. So that's why one thing I like about small press festivals and things like Thought Bubble, because that's where we find the stories, not necessarily in the big publishing houses. And we find those stories more in small press, I think, in the UK at least.
Yeah,
whereas
but
in
not
manga,
at that higher level, on that wider level, like mainstream.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'd agree with that. And like, where's for you, because out of all of us, you're working in the animated medium. So when I saw your work and just seeing the inspiration from anime in a lot of the videos that you produce, same question to you, like, what is it about that style that you particularly like, that you've kind of carried over?
I guess before I go into that quickly, I just wanted to find something that Mikiko said about the differences between manga and anime and how it's used. And I found that quite interesting that in Japan they've got their own word for American comics now.
I like that too. That's quite
because I think when I was growing up, like we had the manga entertainment here, so everything that looks Japanese was just called manga because of this company that was called Manga Entertainment.
Yeah.
And then often online, like, people have debates about what manga is, and that's not anime because it's not Japanese. Even there was debates about Tekken Kinkreed not being Japanese animation because the director is not Japanese of that film, sort of thing. But actually, anime is what they refer to as, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mikiko, but what they refer to as animation. So they would call Toy Story, in Japan, they would call Toy Story anime, because it's just, it's their word for animation. Whereas here, we're like, anime is Japanese animation, sort of thing. So I thought that was a interesting thing that you raised. But yeah, my influences, I think it was just mostly, I don't read a lot of comics anymore. I don't even know if I read that many when I was younger, to be honest. But the influences was more, well, number one, the drawing, especially like the type of details they put in the background, and just the cinematic experience as well. So I think typically if you look at, not so much now, but I think back then when you would stage animation, it was staged in a very kind of almost theatrical way. So you could see their silhouettes and all this kind of stuff. So you could read what the character's doing instantly, which isn't a bad thing necessarily. Whereas I feel like with anime, it was just very cinematic. Where they would place a camera is not something you do in animation. So they're almost treating animation like a medium and not a genre, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think nowadays it's a little bit different, especially like, with companies like Pixar. I mean, the things that they do is very cinematic. If you look at something like WALL-E, for instance, like they spent so much time messing with the lenses to give that kind of imperfect look, and like a very cinematic feel to their visuals. And I feel like with anime, it's very cinematic. It's very kind of, things aren't staged very typically. Like, so even when I'm working on something, I'm not particularly worried about the silhouette of a character. I'm more looking at the image as a whole. I don't know if that's the right way to do things, but even like when I was studying, we'd have a lot of kind of debates about, oh, well, you can't see the character silhouette. I'm like, but you can see the character. So yeah, but if you do the silhouette thing, then you'll be able to see them better. It's like, well, they're not going to be blacked out, so it doesn't really matter. That's the way I think. I understand the logic behind it, but again, it's like, it can be some things, and if you apply color and now you can add depth of field and all that kind of stuff to it, then it shouldn't matter too much. But yeah, but basically the main thing for me was like just the execution of the drawings, how much detail the drawings had, like especially with things like vehicles. So if you look at like Pat Labor or anything like that, the amount of detail and not using computer, like CGI, like not using CGI is insane.
Yeah,
when you look at those things, and to
like
think
workload.
that this was all done on paper is it's mind blowing. If you look at any like Akira line test, like pencil test, it's like, I'm like, how are these people being able to kind of, I mean, how are they still sane, number one, and how are they being able to create such imagery frame by frame over and over again with that amount of detail? So that was something that was really interesting to me. And I guess if we talk, sorry.
Oh, you've reminded me as well that the cinematic aspect is in manga as well. And going back to comparing manga against Western, because I grew up with reading manga. When I made an effort to start reading Western-based comics, things like Marvel, V for Vendetta, all the tick box, Watchmen. Something that jarred with me was how there weren't any of these landscape or like mood panels. There were a couple. Maybe there was a splash page, but in manga they're everywhere.
Yeah.
Manga isn't necessarily 9-panel grid, or you have these very flowy things, or you have the character like looking to one side or something. It's not necessarily about capturing that character, and it's like setting the mood. Cinema is cinematic.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point, because you also mentioned that it has an element that people can relate to. And if you read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, he actually covers this very well about the difference between Western and Asian comics. And the big aspect is that
down here.
So it shows panels with things happening simultaneously, which is emotional or environmental things at the same time as action, while the Western is mostly focused on action to action. And so you'll have like a scene where you'll have a panel of, like, let's say a kitchen, you'll have a panel of something bubbling in the pot, you'll have a panel of like the the steam rising and like little bits and pieces that kind of paint a whole picture, versus like in the West it might not necessarily be laid out that way. And I think when we were like young and we saw our first manga and anime, that might have been a big element of why we got pulled in, is because it very much speaks on an emotional level to us, I think, which might be a bit lacking in other areas. Like I find that a lot of superheroes things don't really interest me that much because they're just too out there.
Yeah.
Like a bit too far, you know, maybe.
I mean, yeah, I think, you know, I think that's going back to what Lara said about the comics being cinematic as well. I think that's a really good point. Like Dragon Ball, I remember the first iterations of Dragon Ball that I got was actually in Japanese. So I didn't know anything about this until, like, I mean, I had the comics, but I couldn't, obviously I can't read Japanese, but I'm going through the panels and understanding what's going on just by looking at the drawings. But the interesting thing about that as well is that the panels, the way they're drawn, you can almost, they almost feel like storyboards. Like you can almost feel when a character's, this scene is slow motion or this scene is going really fast. And that's something I never got from, you know, I guess American comics. And I mean, I'm influenced by everything. I mean, I love MCU. I watch superhero movies and that kind of stuff. And you know, I was big into like Todd McFarlane when I was younger. Then there's he did Danger Girl. Can't remember his name now. It will come to me. Joe Mad as well. He had a bit of it felt like he had a bit of an anime influence to his work as well. But I think definitely with the comics, like Japanese comics, like you could remove the words and kind of gauge about 80% of what's going on just by the way the panels are placed. You know, if a character's distressed, if something's moving really quickly, if something's moving really fast, like yeah, and it's something that I've tried to get into my work even when I'm directing and having it, you know, the advantage of moving an image around and having sound and all that kind of stuff. But just to be able to look at something instantly and you can tell what's going on, I think is a very kind of a powerful thing.
It's quite
I do think
that emotion, like getting that emotion across, and I found that like even more because as well as like creating manga, I work with young people like in schools, and so we're talking from like as young as 7, 8 to sort of 15, 16, and I've noticed like a big interest in manga and just seeing their reaction to it and some of the types of kids that are interested in manga, and I think that varied emotional palette, I just made that phrase up, I don't know if that's a real thing, but just that range of emotions that you get in manga kind of connects more with different types of personalities, and I feel that is a key thing for like drawing people in. So yeah, I definitely agree with like what you guys are saying. So
yeah, I think you've nailed it as well, because I was just thinking out loud, but you nailed it in that I don't want to write off Western comics in the same way I don't want people to write off manga as just Japanese comics altogether. And I think my thinking now is that they are merging. So you are seeing traditional Western MCU comics or DC comics or whatever, taking some of what we would traditionally associate with manga, say those big cinematic splash pages or emotional things happening. Maybe they did happen to some extent back in the day as well, but now it's kind of merging into one. And like that line starts to blur, because if you associate manga or anime with a certain type of drawing or style, where does Ghibli fall into that? Does it, you know? I didn't watch the new Ghibli, the computer generated one yet, but how does that fit into this as well? So it feels to me as if they're kind of merging now, and which is interesting, because I think if comics in general become more mainstream, let's say, like the thought bubble audience are open-minded people because they know that the small press is fantastic and we all want more of that. And the next step would be to start to introduce this idea of comics from around the world and the stories. But going back to your emotional thing as well, I think to just discard everything I've just said. Where are the high intensity emotional comics in the West? So your serial, like the serial comics that have been released every week or whatever, don't see that kind of emotional highs and lows and romance and despair and all of this kind of stuff. I don't see it. But maybe I'm not looking. I'm always open to...
Yeah, it depends. I guess it depends sometimes where you look. But I wanted to touch on, because you brought up like the influences, like the merging the lines between like sort of Western and Japanese animation. So I wanted to touch on that for just a second. So one of the things that I always find funny with talking to people who aren't so into manga is, I guess not everyone's aware of the influences that already exist in Western, whether it's comics, a lot of the times films, that come from manga and anime. So I was just going to take a quick moment. I actually have some notes here that for anyone watching who might say they're not aware of manga, you might have watched something that's already inspired by manga. So let me just throw out some things here. So if you've seen the film Speed Racer, that was inspired by the anime Mac Go Go Go. Monsters Inc. Influences from My Neighbor Totoro, Studio Ghibli. Road to Perdition with Tom Hanks, very much inspired by Lone Wolf and Cub. Pacific Rim, Neon Genesis Evangelion, Inception film. Even Christopher Nolan mentioned influence of the anime Paprika. Alita Battle Angel from a manga, Battle Angel Alita. We actually covered that on our podcast. Another thing we covered on our podcast is the Tom Cruise film Edge of Tomorrow, which is based off the manga All You Need Is Kill. In fact, Lara, you were on that. That was the episode you were on. There you go. Yeah. One that people might know, The Lion King, because there was a lot of controversy over, it being a quote-unquote rip-off of Kimba the White Lion. Another couple ones, Black Swan, I've not seen, but I've been made aware that there is, is it an anime Perfect Blue? I don't know if you guys know that. And then The Matrix, Ghost in the Shell. So if you've seen any of these, you may already be more into manga and anime than you think. So when I put together this list, and just thinking about it in general, so even though the awareness I feel in the West of manga and anime is not so high, there's something about it that Western filmmakers are sort of gaining influence from, or inspiration from. So is there something that they're getting that the general audience is not? So it feels to me like these titles, or like the manga, can only be seen if it's been westernized in some way. Is that true? Or is there some other reason, some other thing that I'm missing? What do you guys think?
So I think I don't think the creators know anything more than the audience. It's really just a case of the creators being creators. So I think since we're all creators, we probably know that if we see something that is amazing, we don't care where it's from, and that we just soak up any sort of inspiration that we can, and ultimately, like, the goal of doing that is to then share what we know or love, and I suppose give it our own voice, right? And I think that's kind of the process that's happening. And I know that, like, there's still always some diehard fans who complain about this westernizing some idea, but I don't really think it's really some band of evil Western directors trying to rip off ideas. It's really just people enjoying something, trying to share it in their own voice. That's kind of my take on it. Sure, there's probably some horrible cases where it's not the case, but that's like my first reaction to this, where this is what we do every day. We look at things, we exchange with other creators what we know and love and enjoy, and then we essentially remix and recreate something with our own voices. And yeah, that's what I think.
So, like I said at the beginning, there may be people watching this that hopefully by now are, if they weren't curious before about manga and anime, are curious and might want to check something out. So if we go around and just say, give like one recommendation. I know it's hard. There's like so much stuff, but if there's something you would suggest someone who is new to the medium go and check out, whether it be manga or an anime, what would you suggest? I would just go first and just say Avatar. Just watch that, and your life will be right. Makiko, what do you think? What would you suggest to people? It's a tough question.
It's kind of difficult because it depends on the age group of who is asking.
Fair
but
point.
I would say Ghibli films. I'm a big fan of the old Ghibli films. So anything between like the first one, Nausicaa, all the way to I don't know when I last. I think Spirited Away. That's where. Yeah,
Okay.
those are like that's the golden years. Those I would absolutely recommend. I'm not so keen on the newer things, I must say.
Okay.
That for anime, just because it's all ages and suits everybody.
Yeah,
if
it's nice and
somebody
safe.
comes from, so if somebody comes more from a like a US comics background, I would suggest watching Akira. Absolutely, absolute masterpiece. Even if it's like I don't know how old now, it's like 30 years old. It still holds up to this day. It's amazing.
You can read it as well. Just good to read.
Yes, and read it. So manga as well.
I've watched the movie
Yeah.
loads of times, and I recently bought the books. I actually did a kind of interview on Cartoon Brew about Akira, like what influenced me most. But yeah, Akira's definitely a good one.
Okay.
Yeah.
What else would you suggest?
For manga, I'm currently really into Dungeon Meshi, which is like a really fun thing. I don't know if it's available in English yet, but I think it recently got a license bought by somebody.
Okay.
And it's like since Dungeons and Dragons is really popular right now, maybe that's up some people's alley. What it is, it's like an adventuring group who goes into dungeons, but they run out of food and they have to start slaying monsters to cook and eat in like a very typical manga style of tasty foods and recipes. So it's like a cooking manga, but with like adventuring. It's really funny. But it has a decent, like it has a really good story too, interesting characters. It's not too cliche in anything, but it's like doesn't take itself seriously when the cliches happen, which is perfect. And so I think that's my recommendation.
Cool.
Since I'm a huge Dungeons and Dragons nerd as well. So
well, I'm a huge food nerd, so I will keep that in mind as well.
The English title is Delicious in Dungeon, I think, or something like that.
It says a lot.
Lara, what would you recommend if you can give one or two things?
I know someone whose opinion was 360 transformed, or 180 transformed from manga just being about young girls and for children. As in, I think he said it's for young children and perverts.
Okay.
His opinion was absolutely changed with 20th Century Boys, which is obviously incredible. But I would also say not only is manga depending on age range, like Nikki has said, but I would also say if you want to go for like a long form serial, like a soap opera kind of thing, versus maybe kind of like a smaller one shot, or, you know, it all depends on how you feel. Do you want to commit to something, or do you want something that's more? Because I think even Akira, even though it's quite big and chunky, it's quite limited at the same thing. Whereas something like 20th Century Boys goes on for 2 seasons, and I think there are 24 volumes in each season. So it's quite hefty. It's quite a commitment, but it is worth it. And of course I agree with Makiko as well. Age range is completely just a whole spectrum.
Okay.
So I would say Sailor Moon is the most perfect thing that's ever been written. I've rounded my circle.
Yeah.
But I genuinely think that I'm still waiting for someone to come to me with an educated flaw in Sailor Moon. Because even when people say, oh, is it too heteronormative? Nope. Is it too like kind of female orientated? Nope. I just think it's really good.
Okay.
Even I reread it as an adult and I still think it holds up. So yeah, I'm gonna go with that.
Cool.
Start as I mean to go on.
All right. like it. Wes, do you have a recommendation, or did you mentioned Akira, right?
Well, no, I was just backing up.
Okay.
Mikiko. I'm gonna say recommended. I want to say two. One Punch Man.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah,
that's a good one.
stuff.
I read it recently. I've never read it before. I've just read it.
Yeah, One Punch Man. I mean, I haven't read it. I've watched the show, season 1, and I was blown away by that. And I guess the other one's Gurren Lagann.
Oh,
Yeah, that would be my other recommendation. That I only watched that this year, and was just
okay.
Yeah, so blown away. And I know I did say the end. We are going to end. We are going to end. But I just want to say, like, the emotional complexity in that story and how it handles death as well is very mature and very well done. It's great for other reasons, but yeah, it just felt it was a very mature telling.
It also, I think it blurs the line a lot between. It's very kind of like when you look on the surface, you can see who the villain is and who the bad guy, but actually the goals of everyone in the protagonist and the antagonist, their goals are all exactly the same. It's just that they have a very different way of trying to, protect the planet, sort of thing. So, and just, the animation style. I mean, I love anything that Trigger does anyway, or Imaishi, but those would be my two recommends in terms of like something that's a bit more new school, I suppose.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right.
I do want to recommend something. Just one more thing. I recently read a book called The Right Way to Make Jump. It's a manga, and it's about how Shonen Jump is made. It's so interesting, and it's all told from the perspective of this failed manga artist. And it's a little bit comical, it's a little bit surreal, but it tells you actually how the history of Shonen Jump, which is one of the biggest ongoing serials of manga in Japan and across the world. So just a really interesting take on how these things are made.
Okay, very meta as well. So I'm gonna try and get as many of those recommendations in the video or podcast show notes, so for people to investigate more. But I just want to end by just letting people know where they can find you. So Wes, where can people find you, your work? Let us know.
You can. I mean, I haven't posted in quite a while. I'm gonna start.
You're busy working.
I've just been busy.
Yeah, animation is hard.
Yeah, definitely working. But then also, like, if I've got nothing to draw, then I don't force myself to post stuff. But Libra Bear is my handle on Instagram, and then my company, The Line Animation, also has an Instagram as well. So you can find me in any one of those two places.
Cool.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm going to add you right now.
Thank you.
And Mikiko, where can people find and see your work?
Yeah, so I've got a website called mikiko.art. That's mikiko.art. And everything's linked there, so you can read most of my comics for free. There's a comics link, as well as a shop, as well as a digital shop, as well as all my social media. So Instagram, Twitter, Patreon, everything is on there. So mikiko.art. Yeah.
Cool. And Lara?
Found you.
I'm the Manga Forum on Instagram. And sometimes it's manga, and most of the time, and some of the time it's my drawings as well. I am part of the Whip Comics in London, which is a comics collective who make comics and talk about our comics. And we did have a table at Thought Bubble. We will be selling our comics at Thought Bubble as well. So very gutted we can't all party in person, but I'm glad we're all meeting like this anyway.
We'll be free soon.
We'll be
Coming at it hard.
One day.
I had a pledge press as the cosplay. There's a cosplay part of, which is the thing we didn't really touch on, did we? Like the cosplay side of Thought Bubble, because it's a thing.
That's a good point.
A thing.
Yeah,
I went in a rubbish costume, Misato Katsuragi from Neo Genesis Evangelion, right? I thought I looked great, but my costume was rubbish. I swore to come back with a vengeance, and I would come back as Commander Katsuragi, which is in the new series, right? I never got around to making the costume. So conveniently, let's do it next year, and I will come dressed.
Now you have time to.
Now I have time.
Yeah, it's also on video, so now you have to do it. It's recorded, so everyone knows it now. So yeah, you can find my work. So I'm, like I mentioned, co-founder of mayamada, and we make manga style, I would say manga-ish comics, all ages comics in our own universe of anthropomorphic characters. So all our characters are animal, human hybrids. So yeah, you can check that out, mayamada.com, also on Twitter and Instagram, mayamada on Twitter, mayamada tees on Instagram, because someone had mayamada and nothing I can do. So yeah, so that's where you can find and see more of our panel's work. Thank you everyone for joining me. I know we could have spoken for a whole length of time about manga and anime. Yeah. I know, and definitely Avatar as well. But thank you all for joining me in this discussion. Thank you to Thought Bubble for giving us this platform, and thank you to everyone watching. Hopefully we have turned some minds 180 degrees, or whatever the appropriate number of degrees to get you to check out some of the manga recommendations.
Yeah, if people want to try manga and then hate it, come chat to me. Because, you know, like, this is the other thing, you know, don't just open your mind.
Yeah, don't dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah.
So, cool. But yeah, no, and what was the other thing I got to mention? I know there's something. Oh yeah, so I mentioned people, websites, social media, done that. Also our podcast. So if you want to hear more deep dives into stories across pop culture, including manga, you can check out the Story X Story podcast. It's mostly audio, although I now might do more video stuff. But anyway, that's at mayamada.com/manga. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will see you next time.